Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Natural World Weekly, the show where we learn about the wonder of our natural world through science and animals. My name is Avery. I'm a biochem student here at UIC, and every week on this show, I'll walk you through a bizarre animal and an interesting natural phenomenon, and you do not need to be a scientist to understand this podcast. I hope you all enjoy this week's episode. Today, we'll be talking about an elusive toad species whose only defense is tumbling down a mountain away from its predators. And I'll be doing a brief breakdown of the hantavirus situation, how dangerous it is, and whether or not you need to be concerned about a new pandemic. In the fall of 2009, the BBC traveled out to the Guiana highlands in the south of Venezuela to film part of a TV special on reptiles and amphibians. They were particularly interested in filming the pebble toad live in action in its natural habitat, as these toads were discovered and first described by Venezuelan herpetologists only 7 years prior. Trekking up the two tepuis, flat-top mountains, that the toads live on, the crew managed to find them and capture the behavior that makes them so captivating to herpetologists and normal people alike. When the pebble toad spots a hairy tarantula coming towards it looking for a snack, the toad immediately lets go of the edge of the mountain, sending itself tumbling at extreme speeds hundreds of feet down several times a day. Whether to protect its body or to camouflage as a rock, or maybe both, the toad instinctively folds its arms and legs in, tucks its head inwards, and braces for impact by tensing all their muscles. Once in this position, from a distance, they're pretty much indistinguishable from a small rock falling down the mountain. I'm linking the original video captured by the BBC and the references in the description. I highly recommend watching the video. Of course, a description cannot fully do it justice. Once they kind of slow down their momentum and are in the clear from predators, they keep going about their normal activities largely unharmed. They're able to sustain getting thrown down a mountain every day, mainly because they're super tiny and partly hollow inside, so they don't weigh much. They range from about 20 to 30 millimeters long, and for reference, that's like the length of a paperclip, the diameter of a quarter, or the size of a grape. When not barreling down the side of a mountain, they survive off eating bugs that are tiny enough for them to digest, like ants and mites. Unlike a lot of other amphibian species, they are thankfully not classified as endangered, but they are still listed as threatened, which is kind of like an intermediate step between fully okay and endangered. The big driver behind this is the fact that they only live on 2 mountains in a very specific region of Venezuela, so literally any challenge or stress in that area would be pretty bad news for them. Another big concern for them, and for all amphibians, like frogs and toads, and our previous guest, the axolotl, is a fungus called chytrid that causes really bad disease for them. You can imagine with such a closely clustered together toad population that an outbreak of this introduced from outside sources could get pretty bad pretty quickly. Now let's zoom out and try to answer the question, why do these toads do this crazy behavior that's really not seen in other toad species or any other animal? Why not just run or hop or swim away from predators like a lot of other toads do? Well, largely because it's such a tiny toad, pebble toads are terrible at running, jumping, and even swimming. Despite being amphibians, which are supposed to spend most of their life in the water, they've been seen drowning on multiple occasions because they're so bad at swimming.
Bruh.
The explanation for why pebble toads have such a different lifestyle and behavior patterns compared to other similar animals comes down to the fact that they are a mountain species. When an animal lives exclusively on mountains, especially in such a short range like the pebble toad, they essentially evolve entirely separate from the common species living on the ground. This explains why they don't share a lot of the behaviors of normal frogs and toads, and there are many other examples of this happening with mountain species, such as farm goats and mountain goats. Because mountain goats evolved separately from other bovines, they have special traits like pads on the bottom of their toes for climbing, and they're actually more closely related to antelopes than to goats. Now, this is about where the story of the pebble toads end, since there's honestly not a lot of information out there about them. Again, they're a pretty recently described species, and they're difficult to study since they only live in two mountains about 8,500 feet above sea level. But I did see the BBC video and figured this would be a cool and lighthearted animal to cover before we dive into the more bleak hantavirus situation in our next segment. Hantavirus has been all over the news lately, or at least it was when I was writing this, because our news cycles are so rapidly changing nowadays. And a lot of people are scared that this virus could potentially cause another pandemic similar to COVID. There's been a lot of online discourse I've seen where experts are saying, oh, it's all good, don't worry. And people are hard pressed to believe them, which I totally get. There was some degree of downplaying during the very early days of COVID, and I think messaging in general throughout all the stages could have been handled better. What I want to accomplish with this segment is breaking down what hantavirus is, its origin, and what's going on right now with the current outbreak from the cruise ship, and actually explaining why or why not we need to be worried about it. Again, I am very much not an expert, but a college student in a STEM field, so take this with a grain of salt. And I will once again list all my sources in the description if you want more details/clarification. All of my scientific and epidemiological information is coming straight from the World Health Organization. Hantavirus isn't one particular virus, but a group of viruses, and they're a zoonotic disease, which basically means they come from animals, but can sometimes infect humans as well. A lot of viruses that we worry about for humans are zoonotic. Some examples are rabies, Ebola, and COVID, which both originate mainly from bats, the Black Plague, and bird flu. For hantaviruses specifically, they come from rats, and they can spread to humans via contact with the rat or their poop, pee, or saliva in the air. It's almost balanced in a weird way because although hantaviruses are often deadly, about 50% of the time with the viruses in North and South America, it really doesn't spread to humans very often. There's also only one hantavirus that we know of that spreads from person to person, the Andes virus, which you may have heard of as the virus that caused this outbreak. It's called the Andes virus because it was first discovered in the Andes region of Argentina and Chile, and until the recent cruise ship incident, it was fully contained to those areas. There's been a couple small Andes outbreaks before, and when spread person to person, it's typically from married couples, as the virus requires very close human contact with someone who has symptoms to actually infect you. But now with that groundwork, we can get into the actual current cruise ship hantavirus outbreak. To be honest, as someone who's interested in infections and disease and public health and all that, it's not surprising to me at all that a cruise ship is the ground zero for a new outbreak. I'm not sure how we can make cruise ships safe from disease outbreaks, because it's literally cramming people from all over the world into a confined space where they can't leave for a certain amount of time. And even when the passengers do get to go on shore, I feel like it just increases the risk even more, since they could be picking up disease from the local area and then bringing it back into the little ship incubation chamber. But anyways, in my mind, the inevitable happened aboard the MV Hondius cruise ship, which set sail from Argentina on April 1st. With 147 people from 23 different countries. They were planning on going across the world to beautiful, remote locations across the southern Atlantic Ocean, including Antarctica, St. Helena, and Ascension Island. Since they were going so far, this was going to be a long cruise with lots of sailing and close contact with all the passengers. Things were chill on the ship, and the disease story doesn't start until day 6 of the cruise. Our patient zero was an older Dutch gentleman who had been traveling across Argentina and Chile as part of a bird watching trip with his wife, as they were ornithologists or scientists of birds. Of course, you can imagine that many public health officials are suspecting that he picked it up during his nature expeditions and brought it onto the ship, which started this whole mess. I honestly don't think there's any way he or anyone else could have initially known, though, since his initial symptoms on day 6 were just like mild flu-like symptoms. However, over the coming days, he would develop the respiratory issues that are common with hantavirus that end up causing deterioration and potential death, which would unfortunately take his life 5 days later. Now, if you remember what I said earlier about how Andes virus transmission works, it needs very close contact to spread. So, not surprisingly, the next case was his wife. I guess I've never really thought about this, but if someone dies on a cruise ship expected to be at sea for a while, you have to make arrangements to dock and deliver the person to a hospital or institution that can help move the body to wherever their home is. So, the crew of the MV Hondius planned to go ashore to deliver her husband's body since they couldn't keep him on such a long expedition. It was this day, April 24th, when they docked on the island of St. Helena, a British island kind of in between South America and Africa, where she also started getting symptoms. Now, obviously, she was distracted by more important stuff going on, and she just wanted to go home. So, unfortunately, she did get on an airplane. Her flights were planned to be from St. Helena to Johannesburg, South Africa, and then she'd fly home to the Netherlands. But unfortunately, her condition got worse by the time she landed in South Africa, and she soon passed away in an emergency room there. This woman and the hospital care team are actually how we figured out what was happening. They did something called a PCR assay on the virus that had infected her to determine what it is. Now, because this is the science segment, of course, I gotta briefly explain what a PCR is. Our genetic material, our DNA, makes more of itself by linking together the small parts that make it up, and they make a whole new strand. A PCR machine, one of the oldest and coolest inventions of biotechnology, does this artificially with the parts and enzymes and everything. Why they used it in Johannesburg is because they were able to take a small amount of the virus and suddenly have a huge sample of it that they could test and identify as the Andes virus. But back to our cruise ship. With how much contact is typically needed to transmit Andes, I would have honestly assumed that this would have been the end of it, but we currently have 13 total cases related to the ship. That same day, April 24th, that they docked in St. Helena, a third person went to the hospital doctor for his symptoms. He was evacuated from the ship, again to Johannesburg, where they also did PCR to confirm his infection. As per the last World Health Organization news in mid-May, he was in the ICU. Unfortunately, the ship doctor eventually started showing symptoms, likely from this last guy, but he and several others on the ship have made a full recovery, although, of course, not before getting on international flights.
Bruh.
Once more confirmed cases started coming and the news got out, the ship crew, sorry about that one, guys, I meant the ship crew. The ship crew realized that they had to quarantine and evacuate, so the rest of the cruise was canceled, unfortunately. They docked in the Netherlands on May 18th and have been quarantining/following up with all the passengers since. There were only a few Americans actually on the ship, so the risk to us in the States is pretty low. So now that you know an overview of the full story, what's the takeaway? In my opinion, I don't think that hantavirus is something you should be concerned about. Stuff that is much more spreadable between humans like COVID, the flu, and diseases that are coming back due to low vaccination rates like measles and smallpox are much more of an immediate threat to you than hantavirus is. A question I had while researching this, though, was what's not to say it could mutate and become more spreadable? COVID is also a virus, and it mutated and became much worse throughout the pandemic. Well, the answer is almost certainly no. It's not going to mutate into some super virus that's very easily spreadable anytime soon. The reason why COVID was able to mutate so often and new strains were seemingly being identified all the time is because it was pretty much everywhere. It's airborne, so COVID particles are all around in the air, and so it replicated and multiplied and spread so often, and replicating yourself is required for mutations and genetic changes to happen. Mutations are like a 1 in a billion crapshoot as to whether or not the genetic material will mess up in its replication, so the more it spreads and replicates, the more likely and often changes will be. So applying this logic to hantavirus, it is very, very slow to spread and doesn't spread through the air, so it has very little opportunity to evolve and change compared to COVID, especially if we helped improve the public health conditions of the Andes, where the most dangerous strain is. And honestly, I think if we just stopped cruises altogether, it would be a big win for public health in general. Thank you all so much for watching this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. I really wanted to talk about the Andes virus outbreak for a while, so I figured I'd include kind of a short and lighthearted animal segment to pair with it. As for updates, I have been taking a break for finals and then summer travel, but I am back at UIC and will be coming out with episodes every week. The next 2 episodes will be summer-themed specials, so be sure to stay tuned for that. Reminder that all sources will be linked in the description, and until next week, remember to stay kind and curious. And don't go on a cruise. Remember to stay kind and curious. And don't go on a cruise.